There are 7.4 billion people in the world. With that comes differences in skin tone, culture, religion, sexual orientation, and race, just to name a few. Of the 325 million people who live in the United States, most Americans believe their own race experiences discrimination. What is discrimination? Discrimination is the unjust treatment of different categories of people or things, especially on the grounds of race, age, or sex. Examples of the daily discrimination against groups of people can be seen every day in mass media. But what effect is this perception of discrimination having on oneself, particularly at the biological level? To understand the idea of perceived discrimination, we must understand what perception is. Perception is a process our brains utilize to interpret given information and to put it into its context or even a schema. A schema is a cognitive framework or concept that helps organize and interpret information in our brain. Many times, however, schemas can lead to the exclusion of important information in order to confirm our pre-existing beliefs. Perception involves both bottom-up and top-down processes. While bottom-up processing focuses on the information from the external world to drive our perception, top-down processing influences our perception using pre-existing knowledge, thoughts, and expectations. The discrimination that exists in America and around the world has begun to show strong correlates with both mental health and physical health problems once it is received onto its intended target. Once perceived, discrimination has been shown to lead to both mental and physical health problems. Perceived discrimination works as a stressor. Stressors like discrimination are uncontrollable and unpredictable, and are especially found to be of most harm to one's health. As one attempts to cope with this discrimination, this can intensify their psychological and stress-related health responses. In addition, discrimination can lead to one's decrease in self-control and ultimately lead to an increase in unhealthy behaviors or a decrease in healthy behaviors.
But why does it matter? What are the consequences of perceived discrimination? There are a lot of different research studies that have explored the impact of feeling discriminated against on one's mental and physical health. A recent story that has been in the news was about the Hongxing Chinese restaurant in Ontario forcing a group of Black customers to pay for their meal before being served. Emil Wickham, noticing that they were the only Black patrons in the restaurant and figuring out that no other parties were asked to prepay, filed a complaint with the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. The restaurant had reasoned that they asked him to pay in advance because of a policy to stop dine-and-dash customers. But after a 4-year legal battle, the restaurant was ordered to pay $10,000 for discrimination. Let's focus first on racial discrimination and its impact on health. For example, C-reactive protein, or CRP, a marker of inflammation, is a known correlate of cardiovascular and other health outcomes, and has also been linked to several psychosocial processes. Lewis et al. In 2010 examined the association between self-reported experiences of racial discrimination and CRP in a sample of 296 older African American adults. Experiences of discrimination were assessed with the Everyday Discrimination Scale, and CRP was assayed from blood samples. Experiences of racial discrimination were associated with higher levels of CRP. Perceived discrimination not only affects one's physical health, but also their mental health. This is demonstrated by a study conducted by Ham et al. In 2010. A nationally representative sample of 2,047 Asian American adults was examined. They found that among women, medium levels of discrimination were enough to predict major depressive disorder, suicidal ideation, and intermittent explosive disorder, whereas high levels of discrimination were required for men. Compared with men, the threshold of racial discrimination was lower for women in affecting mental health status. Now let's talk about the impacts of socioeconomic status, or SES, discrimination. This type of discrimination is also closely connected with racial discrimination. Let's first look at how SES discrimination impacts physical health. Van Dyke et al. In 2016 found that among 401 African American and white adults, SES discrimination was associated with elevated CRP among higher educated African Americans, but not lower educated African Americans or lower educated or higher educated whites. SES discrimination also has impacts on mental health. Asari et al. In 2018 studied 810 African American adolescents. Perceived discrimination was associated with a high risk of lifetime, 12-month, and 30-day major depressive disorder. Additionally, there was a stronger effect of perceived discrimination in youth with high subjective SES. Subjective SES is based on people's opinions of their SES rank, amongst others. Objective measures of SES, which are based on people's place on an income and poverty index, did not interact with perceived discrimination on MDD. Findings suggest that high subjective SES may operate as a vulnerability factor for MDD. We've already talked about how feeling discriminated against has negative effects on both your physical and mental health. It turns out that there are also negative effects that extend beyond just the person being discriminated against. This effect is called vicarious discrimination. For example, there are consequences even for the children of those with perceived discrimination. Thayer and Kazawa in 2015 studied 55 pregnant women in New Zealand. Between 34 and 36 weeks gestation, a prenatal stress questionnaire was administered, and saliva samples taken in the morning and evening on 2 days were obtained. Ostostrain cortisol reactivity was assessed 6 weeks after birth. Women reporting discrimination experience had worse self-rated health, higher evening cortisol, and gave birth to infants with higher cortisol reactivity. These findings suggest that discrimination experience can have biological impacts in pregnancy and across generations. As we have seen in other examples, discrimination impacts both physical and emotional health, and vicarious discrimination is no different. Bakars et al. In 2015 collected data from 1,608 ethnic minority women in the UK over 6 years. Results show that maternal and family experiences of racial discrimination led to a worsening in mothers' mental health 2 years later, and had an indirect effect on children's socio-emotional development 6 years later. This occurred mainly via the worsening in mothers' mental health, but also via an increase in harsh parenting practices. So, in summary, racial discrimination leads to higher CRP and higher risk for major depressive disorder, suicidal ideation, and intermittent explosive disorder, but the risk is greater for women than men. Socioeconomic status discrimination leads to higher CRP in higher educated blacks but not in whites or lower educated blacks, and higher risk for MDD, but the risk is greater for those with high subjective SES but not for high objective SES. And discrimination leads to lower self-rated health and higher cortisol in pregnant mothers, which leads to higher cortisol reactivity in their children. Discrimination also leads to lower mental health in mothers, which leads to lower socio-emotional development in their children.
Perceived discrimination in multiple forms act as a social stress that impact individuals' health through different mechanisms. Individuals experiencing perceived discrimination anticipate that a stressful situation will take place. This anticipation of prejudice or discrimination because of one's social identity can increase vigilance or a hyper-awareness for cues of mistreatment that can lead to detrimental health outcomes if it happens constantly. Let's examine the mechanism behind increased blood pressure as a result of perceived discrimination. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis, is our central stress response system. The HPA axis is an eloquent and a very dynamic intertwining of the central nervous system and endocrine system. A stressful stimulus can kickstart the system by causing the hypothalamus to produce corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH. CRH diffuses through the hypophyseal portal system to bind to receptors in the anterior pituitary gland, which release adrenocorticotropin hormone, or ACTH. ACTH binds to receptors in the adrenal gland, which releases the hormone cortisol. Cortisol hormone further elevates blood pressure, increases heart rate, and has other effects associated with sympathetic system or fight or flight response. This cascade of events activates a wide array of behavioral and physiological responses that are collectively referred to as the stress response. This system is not only activated by life-threatening stress, but is also activated by perceived stress, in this case, perceived discrimination. Perceived discrimination is stressful, and it can act through different mechanisms to cause many health problems. As mentioned previously, perceived discrimination has been linked to increase in CRP levels in the blood serum of affected populations. CRP levels were shown to be elevated due to everyday discrimination, and it can increase cardiovascular diseases and overall mortality. But what is CRP, and what is the biological mechanism behind its effects? CRP is produced by the liver and it cycles in the blood as part of the innate immune system. When the person is exposed to any type of injury or psychological stress, such as perceived discrimination, CRP levels are elevated very dramatically within few hours. CRP then travels to other tissues such as endothelial cells of blood vessels and alters these tissues to further produce inflammatory factors called cytokines. Normally, when the stressor is gone, the liver shuts down the production of CRP to suppress its effects. However, in individuals who are constantly experiencing perceived discrimination, their CRP levels are abnormally high, leading to chronic cardiovascular diseases and diabetes. Anger issues have also been associated with perceived discrimination. So let's examine the neurobiological circuits behind anger and emotional regulation. Conscious awareness of negative cues have been shown to promote the function of a critical emotion regulatory network targeting the amygdala. Amygdala is a group of nuclei located within the anterior medial portion of the brain's temporal lobe. As part of the limbic system, the amygdala is involved in processing of emotions, particularly fear, and is involved in threat detection. A study done by Clark et al. Examined the relation between social threats such as perceived discrimination and amygdala activation. They asked 75 adults to complete self-report rating of discrimination exposure. They also assessed spontaneous amygdala activity and functional connectivity during resting state functional magnetic resonance imaging. Graph A shows results from the regression analysis, which shows greater discrimination exposure to be associated with higher levels of spontaneous left amygdala activity. Graph B shows regions where left amygdala function connectivity strength is associated with discrimination exposure. These findings provide evidence that perceived discrimination is independently associated with elevation in intrinsic amygdala activity and functional connectivity, thus revealing clear parallels between the neural substrates of discrimination and psychological stresses of other regions.
So what can we do to combat perceived discrimination? Besides raising awareness of and trying to dispel discrimination over time, there are ways in which those who feel discriminated against can cope now. The aforementioned studies and more have suggested that discrimination may be one of the causes of racial and gender health disparities. This information has led to the exploration of coping strategies to increase equity in the population's physical and mental health. Coping strategies such as confrontation, seeking social support, and positive reappraisal, which is cognitively reframing an event to be more positive, can buffer the effect of discrimination by challenging the validity of the event and reducing negative feelings about oneself, which in turn can reduce the chance that the event will have a lasting impact on mental health. Having social support and talking with friends and family after discrimination events can rebuild feelings of self-worth and thus prevent the development of depressive symptoms. It can also produce less risky and more healthy behaviors and provide more access to health resources when one is ill. Having a strong connection to a certain group identity, such as an ethnic or gender group, can also buffer the stress of discrimination by preventing negative stereotypes from infecting one's self-concept. In summary, feeling discriminated against can have very detrimental impacts on our physical and mental health. But if we use appropriate coping strategies to combat this, we have a better chance of living healthier lives in spite of the negativity the world throws at us.